So, last week saw the 1-year anniversary of the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine. And since the war broke out, there's been a great deal of confusion on the left as to the nature of this war. Is it a war of national liberation against Russian imperialism? Is it a civil war with foreign intervention? Or is it an inter-imperialist war simply fought out on Ukrainian soil? In order to make sense of all this, it's necessary to understand the long and complicated history of the national question in Ukraine and how it feeds into the current conflict. In this episode of Marxist Voice, Jorge Martin, a writer and activist for the International Marxist Tendency, will do exactly that. Now, unfortunately for technical reasons, the first 2 minutes of this talk is unable to be used, but in these first few minutes, Jorge was simply pointing out that there are at least 3 layers to this current conflict. Firstly, you have the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which represents a conflict between the national sovereignty of Ukraine on one hand and Russian imperialism on another. And then you also have the layer which is the civil war within Ukraine itself, between the government in Kiev and the Donbas region, or properly speaking, the eastern part of the country. And then, of course, you have the inter-imperialist conflict between US imperialism on one hand and Russian imperialism on the other. And Jorge points out that these two imperialist powers are not exactly the same. US imperialism is the largest, the most aggressive, and the most reactionary imperialist power on the planet, and it is also a power which is in decline. Whereas Russia is a much smaller regional power with regional ambitions that is beginning to flex its muscles on a world stage. And with all that said, we can now get started with this week's talk, courtesy of Marxist Voice, the podcast of socialist appeal.
Now, so there are these 3 different layers to this conflict, and the proportions in which these 3 different layers express themselves at different times are different. Say, for instance, in 2014, the conflict was mainly a civil war between southeastern Ukraine and western Ukraine, in which the Ukrainian government in Kiev sent the army against its own people in the Donbas. Now, today, that is not the overriding character of this war, although that still exists. But I would say that the dominant character of this war is an inter-imperialist conflict. Now, as I said, the main subject of this talk is the history of the national question in Ukraine, and we know the national question is linked to the development of the national bourgeoisie, the development of capitalism. We dismiss this idea that's put forward by Ukrainian nationalists and by nationalists in all countries, that they can trace the history back to, 1,000 years ago. Recently, an official Twitter account of the Ukrainian government posted an animated GIF, a little video, where they said that already back in 1899, Ukraine wanted to join the European Union. It's not a joke, but they trace back the origins, the roots of the Ukrainian nation back to Kiev and Rus and so on. At that time, nations did not exist. National sentiment did not exist. And in fact, modern nations are the creation of the bourgeois revolution. And here we find the first problem. The bourgeois played a progressive role in creating nation states in its early days, through revolutionary means in most cases, unifying the nations in terms of language, but also in terms of a common market, a common system of weights and measures, a common system of tariffs, and so on. And this was the historical period of the unification of rise of modern bourgeois nations: France, Britain, Germany later, Italy later, and so on. Spain never completed the process in a progressive way. But in the case of Ukraine was under foreign domination up until, in fact, the first time where an independent modern Ukrainian republic was founded was in 1917. So prior to that, Ukraine was divided between different imperialist powers, and it never developed its own bourgeois, its own capitalist class. There was capitalist development in Ukraine in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, but it was mainly foreign capital, French, British capital. They invested particularly in the Donbas, in steel industry, in the mining and so on, and in the big cities. And this was at a time when, as I say, Ukraine was divided between different imperialist powers. Now, Ukraine is mostly a flat land in Central Europe and Ukraine, Poland. This is mostly flat land, and as a result, between Europe and Asia. And as a result of this has been the place of mass migrations, invasions by different empires coming from Asia or coming from Europe, moving eastwards or westwards and some northwards and so on. And different parts of Ukraine have been in different times of history under different types of foreign domination. For instance, the Crimean Khanate under the domination of the Turkish Ottoman Empire was an important part of southern Ukraine, and determined all these different invasions have determined to this day the national character, the slightly different national characteristics of different regions of modern day Ukraine. Modern day Ukraine, you could say, is a patchwork of different regions that are put together. You have, for instance, Bukovina and Transcarpathia, which are part of Western Ukraine, but they have a completely different character than Volhynia and Galicia, also in Western Ukraine, which are the main site of Ukrainian nationalism, because they were dominated by Moldova, Romania, and Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on, at different times. That's why I'm saying these maps are quite complicated. If you can get your head around this, and then there is, but the basic division of Ukraine, you could say, is division between Western Ukraine, i.e., the regions of Galicia and Volhynia, which were one time part of the Polish-Lithuanian regime. And for quite a long time, they've been part of and under the domination of Western empires, including Poland and so on. And then you have Eastern and Southeastern Ukraine, which has been for a longer period of time under the domination of the Russian Tsarist Empire. And in between, there is, which is based around Kharkiv, and the whole area around the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, and going all the way down to Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, all the places that now have been invaded by Russia or under threat of Russian invasion. And this division, you can see that it seeps through even to today's politics in Ukraine. It was in Western Ukraine that Ukrainian nationalism first emerged, Ukrainian national identity during the 19th century. And this was because that region, that part of Ukraine, was under the domination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where there was a policy of national cultural autonomy. Each people had their own schools in their own languages and so on. This allowed certain room for the development of the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian nation. Around mainly, this area was also very peasant, agricultural, rural based. So it was mainly peasants who spoke the Ukrainian language. And here is where the main, the intellectuals of early nationalism, like Taras Shevchenko, the national poet, rose, developed, codified the language and created a national identity for Ukraine, while the language was completely banned in the areas of Ukraine that were under domination of the Russian Empire. Russia was the Tsarist Empire, was a jailhouse of nations, as Lenin explained, and all minority languages, although the great Russians represented only about 45% of the total population, but all other languages were banned. And the Tsarist Empire used very skillfully the national question, the national oppression, as a way of staying in power, and also anti-Semitism. Ukraine was the site of a long history of anti-Semitic pogroms. But in reality, the composition of the population was a bit peculiar, because Ukrainian-speaking population was mainly concentrated in the countryside amongst the peasants, while in the cities, there were also Ukrainian speakers in the cities, but in the cities, the workers and also the urban petty bourgeois were mainly great Russians, Russian-speaking, and Jewish, and Poles. So that created a division. There was always the tendency of thinking that the Ukrainian nationalism was a backward, peasant ideology, and that there was certainly an element of great Russian chauvinism amongst the workers in the cities. They didn't understand the national question, or these people who spoke this other language that was separate from them. They didn't come into regular contact with, and there was never the development of a national bourgeois. For this reason, this was a complicated situation. Having a correct policy on two questions, on the question of the land, i.e. agrarian reform, and on the question of language and national rights, was very important for the workers' movement in the Russian Empire to be able to succeed. And this was very early recognized by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And the 1903 Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was the name of the Marxist party at that time, they adopted a program which included in point 9 a point about the national question. And they basically said that they were in favor of the right of nations to self-determination, up to and including independence, if they so wished. And also they were in favor of the greatest autonomy and language rights for national minorities. But at the same time that they said this, which is correct, they also said that they were in favor of the unity of the working class party, the unity of the Marxist party across the different national groups. So there was one Russian Social Democratic Labor Party which covered the whole territory of the Russian Tsarist Empire. But this was not an easy discussion. This was Lenin's position, which was adopted by the Congress in 1903, but this was not the position of all Bolsheviks, of all Marxists at that time. Very famously, Rosa Luxemburg, who was a Polish Marxist and obviously very close to this question in Ukraine, adopted the opposite position. She said that she had a very strong anti-nationalist position, which was correct for a Polish Marxist, opposition to the Polish, the leaders of the Polish national movement were reactionary. But at the same time, in her case, this went too far. And she said that the Russian Marxists could not adopt the position of the national self-determination for the oppressed nationalities because this will help the bourgeois, the petty bourgeois and the landlords that were using the national question in Poland and in other nationalities. And she was wrong on this. She was wrong. And had the party adopted that policy, it's doubtful whether they will have carried out a successful Russian Revolution in 1917. But there were others. There were others like Bukharin, Pyatakov, who was Ukrainian himself, Radek, who were also against this Lenin's policy on the national question. And their argument was, which they maintained all the way up until 1919 and after the Russian Revolution, they said, the national question, national self-determination is utopian under capitalism in the epoch of imperialism. There can be the formation of new nations is not possible, therefore this is a utopian slogan. And under socialism, it'll be redundant because there will be the fraternity of all workers regardless of nation. So they were against this policy. We will see that this played a negative role later on in Ukraine. Now, as I said, the first time that the Ukrainian independent or autonomous authority was created was in 1917 after the February Revolution in Russia. February Revolution in Russia, in which, by the way, the taking over of power in Petrograd, Ukrainians played an important role. They, obviously, the overthrow of Tsarist Empire gave rise to all the national movement and so on in all the different republics. And then you had the creation of the Central Rada government in Ukraine, and also the creation of Soviets of workers, peasants, soldiers in Ukraine. The Bolsheviks participated in the Rada, though they were in a minority. And very soon there was a conflict. The conflict emerged between the Central Rada, which was mainly based in Western Ukraine, and the Soviets. They had two completely different policies. In fact, the Central Rada, which was dominated by bourgeois nationalists and petty bourgeois elements, refused to give land to the peasants. This was the crucial question, one of the crucial questions in the revolution in Russia and in Ukraine. And so progressively was losing support amongst its own basis of support that it originally had. The October Revolution was truthful to its word And one of the first acts of the new revolutionary Soviet government was to recognize the independence, national self-determination of all the oppressed nations. Even if that meant, at that time, handing over these countries, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine, and others, handing over these countries to petty bourgeois nationalist elements, in some cases in the form of Mensheviks, in some other cases of petty bourgeois elements, bourgeois nationalists, who were against Soviet power. But it was important for the Soviet power in Petrograd and in Moscow to send a clear signal that they had nothing to do with the Tsarist empire, with the oppression of great Russian imperialism, and that they were for the freedom of the nations. This was the only basis on which they could then wage a campaign to win over these republics to Bolshevism and to win a majority for the workers' and peasants' councils in these regions. Now, but immediately there were problems. The Declaration of Independence of Ukraine was under a republic called the Ukrainian National Republic, the UNR, and immediately, very shortly after its Declaration of Independence in mid-November 1917, the Ukrainian National Republic allowed a Cossack reactionary army to march through its territory in order to go and smash Soviet power in the southeast, in the Donbas mainly, where the Soviets were based on the mining proletariat. This led the Soviet government in Moscow to declare war on the Ukrainian National Republic, and it was the beginning of a civil war. It was a war that had two different aspects to it. The invasion of the Red Army, if you want, but also the invasion of the Red Army was based on the uprising of the workers and peasants in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in all the big cities and industrial centers in Ukraine. So this was, again, a civil war between black and white, if you want, and also the intervention of the Soviet Russia in this. This was then further, the Soviets, the Ukrainian Soviets and the Red Army were in the winning side, but then this was then further complicated by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This was the peace negotiations between Germany and the Soviet government in Russia. And what they were forced by the German advance, Trotsky had a policy of no war, no peace. He wanted to delay the negotiations so that the Soviets were able to make an appeal to the revolutionary masses in Germany, trigger a German revolution, and then be able not to have to sign any peace in detrimental terms with Germany. But this didn't happen. Didn't happen at that time in the spring of 1918. The German high command obviously wasn't stupid. They realized what the Soviets were doing, and then they decided to advance. While they were still talking in Brest-Litovsk, they decided to advance, and they took over quite a lot of Ukraine, and they forced settlement, the Brest-Litovsk agreement, by which Soviet Russia was handing over large parts of the majority of Ukraine. So the majority of Ukraine was, for a period of few months, and Austro-Hungarian domination, and the Red Army was pushed back. So I'm just saying, this then gave rise to, then in November 1918, there was a German revolution. The Soviets then said, well, the Brest-Litovsk agreement is finished, and then they decided to intervene in Ukraine again. And then there was the beginning of a civil war that lasted for 2 or 3 years. That was extremely complicated. It wasn't just two sides. There were, 25 different sides. There was a part of that civil war which was a Ukrainian-Polish war in western Ukraine. There was also the Ukrainian National Republic, which allied itself with German and Austro-Hungarian imperialism. Then there was the war between the whites, i.e. the counter-revolutionaries, and the reds, i.e. the Soviet government, which was also taking place in the territory of Ukraine, which was one of the bases of counter-revolution, the Denikin armies and so on. Then there was the Mahnoite I hesitate to call them anarchists, but the Magnoite peasant armies that they were doing their own thing, sometimes allied with the Reds, sometimes allied with the Whites. In the middle of all this, there was the formation of the Hetmanate, which was a Ukrainian authority, a Ukrainian dictatorship that was allied to Western imperialism. 1.5 million people died, and many cities changed sides many times. There were massacres and so on. And during this war, there were also massive anti-Semitic pogroms committed by all sides, with the exception of the Red Army. And what this demonstrated, this period of extreme turmoil and confusion, what this demonstrated is that something that then was ratified in the Second World War. There was no room in these republics, not in Ukraine, not in Georgia, not in Poland, not in any of these newly independent countries. There was no room for a halfway, properly independent, sovereign, bourgeois democratic country. There were only two alternatives: either domination by Western imperialism and a dictatorship, a ferocious dictatorship in this case, or Soviet power, i.e. the workers and peasants coming to power. There was no middle way. Any attempt at national independence was completely crushed by the circumstances. It was at this point, I think it was at the end of 1919, beginning of 1920, that Lenin, on the back of the advance of the Red Army into Ukraine, made a very famous speech, which is called a letter to the workers and peasants of Ukraine. It's on the website. I recommend comrades to read it. It's quite a long document, but it explains Lenin's policy on the national question, which was extremely careful and was designed to do two things. One, to convince the Ukrainian workers and peasants that the Red Army had nothing to do with Tsarist nationalism, and that Ukraine was independent. The Soviet power had recognized the independence of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian workers and peasants had to decide their own future, whether they wanted a completely independent country, an independent country that was federated with Russia in different degrees, a confederation, or a complete amalgamation. But that was not for the Russian Marxists or workers to decide. It was for the Ukrainian workers and peasants to decide. And in this letter, he says, he's extremely very careful. He says, we want unity, but we want a voluntary unity. And we recognize that such a union cannot be effected at one stroke. We have to work towards it with the greatest patience, so as not to spoil matters and not to arouse distrust. And so that the distrust inherited from centuries of landowner and capitalist oppression, centuries private property, and the enmity caused by its divisions and redivisions may have a chance to wear off. This was Lenin's policy. But here Lenin was not just addressing the Ukrainian workers and peasants, he was addressing the Ukrainian Bolsheviks who had a wrong position on this question. The first head of Soviet power in Ukraine, unfortunately, was Pyatakov, who was a Ukrainian Bolshevik, an old Bolshevik, but he had a completely wrong position. He had an ultra-left position, and he argued for this in the party. And he said what I said before, that Ukrainian, the national self-determination is utopian under capitalism in the epoch of imperialism, and it's redundant under socialism. So he said, look, we already have socialism, we have Soviet power, and therefore there should be no talk of nationalism or anything like this. This was his wish, but nationalism did exist and played a big role. And as Lenin explained, centuries of oppression and grievances and so on had a big impact in the psychology of the masses in Ukraine, particularly of the peasants. And at that time, you couldn't have a successful revolution in Ukraine without winning over the peasantry. That's quite clear. Lenin's policy actually was successful. And then the second head of Soviet power in Ukraine was Rakovsky, the Balkan internationalist. But he also had a wrong position on Ukraine. In fact, his position was that Ukrainian nationalism didn't exist, that it was an invention of a few intellectuals and you didn't have to take it into account. This created lots of problems and aggravated the situation in Ukraine. To his credit, he then later in 1921 changed his position and came to Lenin's point of view. Lenin's very careful position allowed the Bolsheviks to win over a section of the left social revolutionaries in Ukraine, which was mainly a peasant party. This peasant party in Russia had risen up in 1918 against Soviet power, but in Ukraine joined, united, fused with the Bolshevik party to create a united communist party. And Lenin said, we have differences. There were differences amongst the Ukrainian communists about the question of whether Ukraine should be independent or not, about whether the party should be independent and affiliate directly to the Comintern and things like this. Said, let's not allow these secondary questions to divide us. We're all fighting for workers' power against the capitalists, the landowners, and Western imperialism. Let's unite on that basis. All the other technical questions of the limitation of borders, the degree of federation, and all that, we can discuss later on over time in a patient way. And he said something. My time is not time is against me, but I will quote this because I think it's a very important quote. He said, "Thank you." He said, if a great Russian communist insists upon the amalgamation of the Ukraine with Russia, Ukrainians might easily suspect him of advocating this policy not from the motive of uniting the proletarians in the fight against capital, but because of prejudices of the old great Russian nationalism of imperialism. Such mistrust is natural and to a certain degree inevitable and legitimate, Lenin says. So Lenin is warning the great Russian communists to be careful because of history. But then he says, if a Ukrainian communist insists upon the unconditional state independence of Ukraine, he lays himself open to the suspicion that he's supporting this policy not because of the temporary interest of the Ukrainian workers and peasants in the struggle against capital, but on account of petty bourgeois national prejudices of the small owner. So he's attacking both the danger of nationalist prejudices on the part of the great Russian nationalists, but also on the part of the Ukrainian nationalists. It's very interesting. Consequently, we great Russian communists must repress with the utmost severity the slightest manifestation in our midst of great Russian nationalism. And you can see clearly that this is not just a letter to Ukrainian workers and peasants. This is a letter to his own party members in Ukraine who had the wrong policy on this question.